Okay, let's do a little Gemara before we don't have so much time left, but we'll do something. Okay, I want to share actually from the previous Gemara. I didn't have time at Yom Kippur to properly review this, but there's two things I want to talk about, and if we'll have time for both of them. So we had this idea. The Gemara said the Gemara quoted three sages, two sages which said, "Let Moshiach come, not in my time," because they were worried about the pain involved in Moshiach's coming. And Rav Yosef, who said, "Let me be in the shadow of the dung of Moshiach's donkey," meaning I'll take that humiliation and pain, but let me see Moshiach. So the Rabbi builds a whole profile around this. There's a few different talks actually, where the Rabbi talks about Rav Yosef as his personality. There's a few different statements that Rav Yosef has said, which the Rabbi builds a personality about who Rav Yosef was. First of all, there's a famous bit Rav Yosef said, "Kama Yosef Yikabashuka," that if not for Matan Torah, how many Yosef would there be in the market? Which talks a lot about who he is. In other words, that his whole personality was tied up with Torah. In this context, Rabbi writes the famous Gemara, which says, the Mishnah, which says that when Rabbi Yehuda died, there was no more humility. No more humility. Anava. Kishemes Rabbi Batla Anava. When Rabbi died, there was no more Anava, no more humility. And Rabbi Yosef says, "I'll take care of Anava. Don't say that humility no longer exists. The Ika no, because I'm here." As if to say he symbolized humility. That was a famous talk.
Doesn't sound very humble.
Doesn't sound very humble. And Rebbe has a whole famous talk about that, and about a number of talks where it talks about specifically this idea. What does this mean? A person saying "I'm humble," and what that even means, and why Rabbi Yosef, and I think the other one was Rabbi Chizda, who said something else. A whole explanation. The bottom line of which is that humility doesn't mean a person doesn't know what he's valued, but he acknowledges what he has as a gift from Hashem. So what Rebbe says basically is that, which means that when Rabbi Yosef says "I'm humble," what he's really saying is even my humility is a gift from Hashem. And if we can say it without pretension. A long explanation. But for this context here, Rebbe cites that Rav Yosef is the ultimate humility. Here he is, willing to sit in the most disgraced way, sitting in the shadow of the dung of Moshiach, just so that he can live to see Moshiach with the greatest of humility. Meaning it takes a huge amount of humility to say, "I'm willing to take that kind of shame and the pain that comes along with it," which the other sages said they don't want it. They don't want that pain. But he was humble enough to say that he'll take it as long as Moshiach comes. Never explains further what does it have to do. Why specifically the dung and the shadow of the dung of Moshiach? Why specifically that to describe it? So we explained this when we talked about the two different ways in which Moshiach can come, either on the clouds or on a donkey. And we explained the Chassidus says that the donkey, which in Hebrew is chamor, comes from the same word as chomer, which is materialism. Donkey and materialism are the same. We explained that it's a reference to this idea that the materialism of this world is transformed to be expressors of Hashem's truth. Now materialism conceals godliness, and when Moshiach comes, materialism will reveal godliness. That connects this to the famous Rambam at the end, which says, "Yilchem Mechamas Hashem," describing Moshiach's, one of his accomplishments is that he fights the battles of Hashem. So even though the Rabbi says that it's true, it could be talking about a physical battle, protecting Jews, which is Bavas Einei Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the apple of a God's eye. So protecting Jews physically is the battle of Hashem. But the Rabbi explains that in the context, it seems like the battle you're fighting is a spiritual battle of God. That is to say, all the concealment of Hashem should no longer be concealment. Furthermore, and the Rabbi even connects it to Yom Kippur, since we're the day after Yom Kippur, when the high priest went to the Holy of Holies, we described that he said Mishfodesh Yotze, he would say the name of Hashem as it is written. Today, we pronounce Hashem's name not as it's written, we pronounce it in a different way. And when Moshiach comes, we're told Keshem Shani Nichtav Ani Nikra, that we're going to read God's name as it's written. That is to say, all Jews will be on a level, all Jews everywhere, and the entire world will be at such a level as the high priest was when he walked into the Holy of Holies. And therefore he can pronounce God's name even as it's pronounced. It's the ultimate revelation. So it says it about this. Chamor, the donkey, we said it was materialism, but a donkey is a living animal, which is higher than that which grows, and certainly higher than that which is inanimate. Right? A donkey, especially if you're talking about Mashiach's donkey, which, as the Gemara said before, was miraculous because it has all those colors, and elsewhere compares the donkey to the donkey of Pinchas ben Yair. Famous donkey Pinchas ben Yair was the donkey who didn't work on Shabbos. But this here, Rabbi Yosef saying that what's the humiliation of Mashiach coming? Not just the donkey, but the worst part of the donkey, the excrement of the donkey. Not just the materialism, but on a higher level of materialism, but the lowest level of materialism. The excrement of the donkey, which is inanimate. Essentially, it's the lowest level of materialism. And this materialism becomes the shadow for Rabbi Yosef. Shadow meaning protection. As if to say, Rabbi Yosef is willing to take the humility that the elevation of Mashiach's coming reaches so low within our realm that even the lowest realm, the dung of a donkey, becomes shadow, becomes a protection, becomes a revealer and expresser of God's truth. That's the length Rabbi Yosef is going to go to. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, in building Rabbi Yosef's profile, as I mentioned a number of times, the Rebbe talks about this, but here it adds another element of Rabbi Yosef's profile, which is that he was blind. Rabbi Yosef was blind. And it says in Seder Olam, Seder Olam is a book of Jewish history. There it writes that how did Rabbi Yosef become blind? A number of Psalms talk about this. Rabbi Yosef became blind because he did not want to be in Chizadai Alma, which means he didn't want to see what this world is. So he sat in a place of darkness to the point that he became blind. He self-inflicted his blindness because he did not want to engage in this physical world. He wanted to be a part of it. He wanted to be separate from this physical world. And then we're going on to say, the pasuk says, you have to take care of your health. So as a basic allowed to do this. But the halach is that if it's connected to teshuvah, a person's allowed to. Meaning if this self-inflicted pain is going to help him do teshuvah, and he's allowed to. And so here Yosef wanted to have this highest level of teshuvah. He wanted to disengage from this world to the point that he made himself blind. And what does Rabbi Yosef say? The people who say they don't want Mashiach.
See it exactly.
The people who say they don't want Mashiach, they say,
let him come, but I want to see it.
Yeah, no, they don't say you see it. The other ones say,
they say I should not see it.
No, V'achmana means I shouldn't learn from it, right?
No, Echmana means to see it. Echmana, like the Aramaic to see.
Yeah. Okay, Rabbi Yosef says.
No, he says I should come. I let him
I'll be right, I don't want to see it. Yeah. But Rabbi Yosef said, sorry. V'aski the isid b'tul the kesam.
Right, he hasn't mentioned b'si, he can't see. He's blind.
He can't see, but he's still willing to do it.
Yeah.
It's adding to his humility. Even though he's blind, he doesn't have necessarily the same virtues as everybody else, but he still is willing to live and see Mashiach's coming. So that's the first thing I want to share. And the other thing, with the last few minutes we have, is we talked a little about this idea that the Gemara said that a person can be saved from the Chevle Mashiach, the pain of Mashiach, if he does Torah and Tzedakah. So he can save himself from. So there points to the Rashi. The Sikh is not. The talk is a little bit unclear exactly, but this is my understanding of what the Rebbe said. But the Rashi here on Chevle Mashiach, when it describes what Chevle Mashiach means, where is it?
It's about the middle of the Rashi, a little bit about Chevle from Gorelai and also the Pachad.
Yeah, so here Rashi says there's a whole elsewhere in Saita. I think it's in Saita when Rashi says Chevle Mashiach. When the Gemara says the Chevle of Mashiach, there Rashi says it comes from the language of like birth pangs. It's in the Gemara in Saita, I believe. They don't quote it here, but here Rashi doesn't say that. Here Rashi says, why can't I find it? Yeah, Chevle Mashiach, Gairaloi, which means like not Chevle as in the birth pangs of Mashiach, birth pangs, but Chevle as in like his lot. And the Gemara, then he says, what's the Gemara can explain later what it means. And Lishnachin, Rashi gives another explanation. And Chevle means pachadim, fear. There's the fear of the oppressors of the nations of the world. The fear of that. So here, Rashi doesn't explain Chevle Mashiach as the birth pangs of Mashiach, but rather it talks about the fear of oppression. And Rebbe says like this, it's a beautiful taich. What's the greatest Chevle Mashiach? It's not the actual fear. There's no greater depth of exile than the fact that the Jew thinks he has to be afraid of the nations of the world. It's the mistaken fear, that's the depth of the exile. There were cites to the famous line from the previous Rebbe, which said when he was being exiled, he said famously that only our bodies go into exile, but a Jewish soul doesn't go to exile. And therefore, on the soul level, we're all one. We're all connected, even though I'm physically very far away. So this is to say, if a Jew is in Torah and Gemilas Sodom, which means he's living a life of the soul, then he's saved from the Chevla Mashiach, he's saved from the notion of being afraid of the nations of the world. Why should he be afraid? Even when they are oppressing you, he's not afraid. Because he's connected to a higher level, he's connected to a higher source. So in connecting to this Rashi, which describes Chevla Mashiach not as the birth pangs of exile, which explains elsewhere, but here explains it as the fear of the nations, a person who is fully engrossed in Torah and Gemilas Sodom and Torah and good deeds, that he has no reason to be afraid of the nations of the world. And even if they are scary, he's still not afraid. Because he lives in a life of the soul. And that's the way he can save himself. Not that the Chevla Mashiach, not that the pains of Golus stop happening. But he's not afraid of it. Because that's how Rashi describes it here as the fear.
When Hasidim were being killed, and they were sanctifying God by saying the Shema and saying their own Kaddish for themselves before they died. In the story I was mentioning to you, my mother says, who are the victims and who are the victors?
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
The soul is filled with life. It's the other ones who are dead.
Yeah. Many a Jew died singing Aleinu. Many a Jew.
And singing, Emunah Shlema.
Yeah.
Friedrich Rebbe, when he stood up to the communists, that was his attitude, I guess.
Yeah, this was a statement that in that context he said, a famous way, there were communists listening to the speech and he didn't care. He said, only the bodies go into exile, our souls don't go into exile. A whole famous speech. They've explained that speech 1,000 times on different levels, and every single word that breaks down of that speech and the mimer and all of it. Okay, wonderful day, everybody.
God bless you.
Taka don tshuva. Get yom tov.
Thank you.